In the case that you have geometry from an old release of AutoCAD prior to the geometric and dimensional constraints, or you just happen to receive a drawing from someone who's not using constraints, what's the most efficient way to take that drawing and turn it into a constraint parametrically driven type drawing? Well, the answer to that is going to be AutoConstraint. So the first thing we want to do is go here and show all geometric constraints, and that just makes sure that we don't have any constraints in the drawing that simply are not being displayed. So once we do show all, we verify that nothing is there. Now we just proceed to AutoConstrain. We window around the geometry, enter, a little bit of processing occurs, and the constraints come back. Now what's important to note here is that the constraints you get are really a function of how well the drawing was prepared in the first place. For example, when we look at a concentric constraint here, we see that it references this circle to this arc segment. So that means they have the same centering point. We see things like parallel lines here or perpendicular lines in the corner or lines across the bottom of the building footprint here that are collinear. These constraints could not have been computed if everything weren't drawn right in the first place. So it's kind of like the old rule, garbage in, garbage out. Good geometry will almost always mean a good result from the AutoConstraint. And one thing that's important to note here is that you can use this little arrow, which is easy to miss if you don't look, and get to the geometric constraint settings. You look at the AutoConstraint tab here, and what we see is the priority of evaluation for the constraints as they are auto-constrained or auto-generated. So we can see coincident points happen first, collinear, followed by parallel and perpendicular, and on down here. Now, as we saw in an example with relaxed constraints in another segment, it's advisable to construct or constrain geometry like we see in this example to use parallel and perpendicular control. That leaves open the possibility of, say, being able to rotate this building. Whereas if these wall segments were constrained to be horizontal or vertical, it would be almost impossible to revolve or rotate this building geometry around without having to relax the constraints. So that's why you see the constraints in the order they're in. However, you don't have to accept that. If you really wanted these segments to be construed as horizontal or vertical, you could take these and then move them up, very much like you would, let's say, in the Files tab of the Options command. So it's very easy to control that. If you wanted to reorder these, as I'm doing here, then you would simply OK this to accept the changes. What you would want to do now is to delete these constraints, which you can do with the Delete Constraints control here, windowing around the geometry, once again, so the constraints would go away, and then we would auto-constrain once again, this time with the new settings in force. Enter, and the processing will occur, and what we'll see is the type of constraints we get back are horizontal or vertical in nature, as opposed to parallel and perpendicular. So with auto-constrain and the delete constraints, you have the capability to take old geometry and turn it into parametrically driven, fully constrained geometry that makes your drawing behave in a parametric fashion. That's it, AutoConstraints. Very straightforward to use.